Hi, Victoria.
Oh,
How you doing this morning?
good. Well, it's evening for me here in England.
Great. Well, really
Oh,
lovely to connect with you.
oh,
I wish I had had more time before our chat to finish reading your entire dissertation, but chapter two is just, it's the favorite thing I've read in a while.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
I'm so grateful to be on here with you and also just for what you do in terms of the philosophical community. And, it's wonderful to have this safe space where the peculiar synthesis of the Platinian Bergsonian metaphysic is recognized as the superior apotheosis of philosophy.
that's right. Yeah, and we're going to amplify that today, I hope.
Oh, yeah.
Um, so yeah, I usually just launch into these things. I don't know if you uh, had any questions about how to proceed, or I can just start asking you questions and digging into this thesis of yours. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. I think that we'll probably have lots to chat about. So,
Yeah. So, I've definitely read um, Bergson, and certainly he's a major influence on Whitehead, but my home base is, Whitehead's philosophy. And like Bergson, this representational theory of mind is one of Whitehead's main targets. And certainly he builds on, the ground that Bergson lays out. But let's back up. I'm curious, why did memory become such a important topic for you? Why did you decide to write a dissertation on that?
it's such a great question. I was an undergraduate studying philosophy. I went to Columbia and I was reading the Confessions for the second time when I was about 18 years old. And I was really just drawn to Augustine's philosophy and especially his philosophizing in the latter half of the Confessions in books 10 and 11 when he starts to discuss memory and time. And for some reason or other, around that time, I had also started learning about Bergson, just independently, not anything to do with the courses I was taking. And for some reason, Matter and Memory was the first was the first Bergson book I picked up.
Mhm.
It's taken me, like 5 years to really master that text, and because it's so complicated. But it's so complicated in its simplicity. And I was just so struck by initially the similarity between these two philosophies, how memory has really been drawn out and pinpointed by both of them independently of each other as this central aspect of psychological conscious life. And I just felt like all of the readings I was doing in philosophy, contemporary philosophy of mind at the time, just didn't even really account for memory in the ontology of the human mind. Everything had been sort of reduced to knowledge, beliefs, perceptions, maybe intentionality in a kind of Dennett sense, but memory, that thing that really is the continuity and is one of these striking just features of our mental, cognitive, conscious capacity, had almost been entirely left out of the contemporary discourse. And of
Mhm.
course, if Bergson's thesis in Matter and Memory is true, that memory in some way holds the key to the hard problem of consciousness, then surely it should be something that's worthy of more attention from philosophers.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the key to getting us out of that false problem, right? Um,
Exactly.
so you say at the beginning of chapter two of your dissertation, which focuses on these the hard problem, you could say, and the computational model of mind, that you say some readers may find this a digressive chapter, while for others it may be the most important of all. And granted, I haven't read the rest of it yet, but I'm pretty sure that this is the key. Understanding how Bergson's account of perception and memory, um, over 100, what this was in the 1890s that Matter and Memory came out, right?
Yeah, 1898.
So almost more than almost 130 years ago, Bergson is, I think, still ahead of us, or still ahead of philosophy of mind and cognitive science and understanding some of these issues. So, mm, similarly with like, predictive processing is all the rage nowadays. But Helmholtz laid that out also almost 150 years ago. And we're acting like so much of the philosophy of mind nowadays seems to me to be rehashing of old philosophical problems in a scientific garb, using fancy fMRI images to make it seem like, we now know. But so I'm having trouble knowing where to start, maybe with this localization thesis that many people, um, academics and your average person who reflects um, on the nature of the mind-brain relationship just assumes that memories are located somewhere in the brain. And similarly, that perception is some kind of representation going on inside the skull. Um, why is that so wrong? Just to scratch the surface and we'll dig deeper into that. But why is that so wrong?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you bring up that there's this catching up always going on. These ideas scientific facts sort of crash like a tidal wave upon the human race, and the thinkers are there kind of sorting out the debris, and the ideas then sort of fall in that on that shore in that collision between the facts and the realm of ideas. And it's not till hundreds of years later that we are even processing these things properly. So similarly, you find in sort of contemporary cognitive science and neuroscience a reconceptualization of the working hypothesis of 18th century philosophy. So, we're still working with Locke and Hume and this very kind of really, and which itself is kind of like a reincarnation of almost like Democritus and Lucretius, a kind of atomistic psychology. So we've had this way of kind of cleaving up the mind into distinct entities and distinct things. And we've forced ourselves conceptually to imagine that these things are united by these kinds of a priori relationships or law-like relationships in this kind of container, which we think of as mind. And, this whole idea of mind as this sort of container of thoughts and perceptions and desires that are all united in these kind of mathematical, perfect relationships, is really just also an emptying or an abstractifying of what would have just been thought of as soul. For most of human thought, since antiquity at least. And so you kind of are getting this like progressive attenuation or weakening of the complexity of these phenomena and of the ability to actually see the phenomena directly or describe them in a kind of bare way, because the concepts that we associate just start to really mold how we think about these things. And so, yeah, it's become just absolutely ordinary discourse this day and age to have a TED talk with a neuroscientist who's just talking about how, when you're remembering, like your brain is just doing this, and your brain wants this and your brain wants that. Well, wait, hold on. The brain doesn't want anything. The brain's not a human being. I really actually like kind of the Wittgensteinian ordinary language philosophy kind of people just sometimes for just this point.
Sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely only sometimes. But for just this point in particular, which is wait, hold on. What you just said, that sentence has no meaning. It's nonsense because you're personifying the brain. And you're speaking of the brain and attributing to it these activities and operations that really can only be properly attributed to a human being, to an organism. And the problem is that there's no philosophical clarity as to where the empirical observation ends and where the metaphysical presuppositions enter into the picture. And so
Yeah.
I think part of the effort of what I was trying to do here was sort of look at Bergson's theory in light of the contemporary development of neuroscience and say, well, have we made any substantial progress on this front? And there's obviously empirical progress. But the problem is that nobody is really clear on when the empirical, when the observation part of the study is over, and when, well, this really all means that metaphysical hypothesizing part begins. And
Mm.
I think that's where philosophers, should hopefully come in handy, or should start coming in handy again.
Yeah, no, we have our work cut out for us, certainly, because, you know, popularizations of neuroscience made the have put us in a situation where it almost seems absurd to question that thoughts occur inside the skull, and that you're made to seem anti-scientific or, woo if you dare to argue for an alternative to that point of view, to the cerebral deposit, point of view. Um, but you talk about the blind or the brain initiative or brain project that got like $1 billion of funding. And I remember when um, Barack Obama was announcing that in the White House and made this joke about how maybe after this research uh, has gone on for a few years, we'll be able to resolve some of our political disputes in Washington because we'll understand what's gone wrong in the brain to make Republicans and Democrats not like each other. So, and haha, but also, you know, the stakes are pretty high here in how we understand what consciousness is and what the human being is, if we can even, um, if the human being even shows up in the context of scientific research, because often it seems like, yeah, we're just dealing with organ systems or abstract models even of organ systems. And so it's not just that we might be wasting a bunch of funding on a particular research program that's, just running up a blind alley. It's also that our politics, our cultural life gets shaped and I think degraded by this understanding of what a human mind is, as if it were something that could just be understood by analogy to some kind of a computer. And so the stakes are really high here. I think the ways that we come to talk about and understand uh, perception, memory, consciousness um, have real consequence, for our capacity to survive the technological um, transformations that are underway. Because these new tools are coming online that make it even more tempting to reduce what we are as speaking animals to computational processes. And I think the more that we allow that to happen, the more we go down a very dystopian path, right? So I think this type of work to uncover where the science and the empirical study gets sort of surreptitiously merged with metaphysics and bad metaphysics, uncovering how that happens is so important. So I hope we can make a little dent, or at least give people some hesitation before just going along with that idea that mind is brain. Um,
Yeah, and I definitely think that idea is dying, and is in its death rattle. I mean, I think that people that are our generation and younger are just not buying into, they don't care about the kind of, I don't know, four horsemen, atheistic, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Cox, description of the universe. They're more into, I don't know, manifestation and astrology and into more of that woo-woo stuff.
mhm,
I'm spiritual but not religious. And I think a lot of that is, in part a reaction to waking up to this, the kind of a mess, that's created by this overly technological, mechanistic view of the human person and human flourishing. People are just aware that like happiness is something that's sort of beyond what we've been promised in the contemporary iteration of society. And I think that where philosophy is really important is coming in there with a rational and a rigorous alternative, right? Like the alternative is not just this kind of like, well, everything's conscious, panpsychism to the max, like quantum entanglement, bro style of thinking, which is like, there's a certain amount of that that's interesting and cool, but there's also a lot of that that's not really well thought out. And if you know if the public is not shown a kind of middle path that's perfectly, you know, reasonable, rooted in a deep intellectual tradition that goes back thousands of years, capable of drawing upon the sciences, interpreting the data of scientific discoveries in the present, while also, you know, drawing upon that realm of pure ideas and honoring things like the mind, but providing a positive definition of the mind that's rigorous and clear. I think that that's really what people are looking for, you know, not one extreme or the other. And what's really interesting is that in contemporary philosophy, I mean, you know, all the philosophers that I know and, you know, kind of grew up with and were taught by are mostly analytic philosophers. But even in there, you know, the materialism and reductive, eliminative materialism, reductive materialism has really been recognized now as a failed hypothesis. And, you know, they've all gravitated towards a kind of property dualism, emergentism, non-reductive physicalism, which, you know, these things are also, you know, can be quite conceptually hairy and conceptually confused. And of course, there's like 10,000 variations of each one of them. Um,
Mhm.
but the gist is that we are never actually going to know epistemologically this one-to-one ratio of reduction between mind to brain, and there is really something to these qualia arguments regarding the irreducibility of conscious experience. And so we have to, you know, establish some kind of like grounding principles or links that unite the physical to the mental without reducing the mental to the physical. And so we're really at a turning point in philosophy, in mainstream philosophy, that's rejected reductive materialism and functionalism even. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting time to provide rigorous middle path alternative metaphysics.
Hmm. So let's dig into the some of the arguments you make here. The information processing metaphor of the mind and the attempt to describe the brain and neural connections as both obviously analog in one sense, but somehow also able to support digital code. Um, can you unpack the problem with this metaphor that forgets it's a metaphor, that somehow the brain can achieve this information, this digital information processing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest discoveries and theories, and one of the most important conceptual revolutions of the past, you know, 100 years is Shannon's theory of information, Claude Shannon. And he was applying his theory of information to electronic communication systems, really, as a way of, you know, as an engineering kind of innovation between a transmitter and a receiver. Now, Claude Shannon's theory of information has since been sort of imputed to all different kinds of domains, whether it's physics or whether it's computation. And really, it's one of the key theoretical revolutions behind, you know, LLM AI technology. Um, and I think, yeah, it's interesting to ask to what extent this information, as it's being thought of, like if we're thinking about physicists, for example, to what extent are they conceptualizing this information as something, you know, physical, embodied, or what extent it's participating in this kind of like immaterial principle or law-like, you know, structure.
Right.
And some physicists are really apt to think of information and speak of information like it's this kind of, you know, immaterial principle of organization.
Hmm.
It's like
Right. It's like, are you materialists or you Pythagoreans? Like, what's going
yeah,
on?
exactly. Yeah. So just and while others are really are you know keen to kind of reduce information to physical goings on, and this is this whole like bit from it or it from bit debate that's been happening between physicists for a while now.
Mhm.
And you know, is everything really derived from this binary code and like somehow that's also quantum?
Mhm.
Or is it, you know, that always gets mixed into that idea. Or is the digital arising from the material hardware? Now we know that in a computer, it's the innovations on the material hardware front that allow for software innovations, right? So it's the engineering that happened, in with companies like Dell and Intel, who figured out that we can physically create a silicon chip that has capacitors and transistors and perfectly organizes movements of electrons and electricity in such a way that it doesn't overheat. And it's really that innovation and making that innovation smaller and smaller that has allowed for a greater innovation on the software front. It's interesting to note, by the way, that all of the sort of recent technological computational advances have been software ones and not hardware ones. We're really operating with that same hardware technology. It's just being, made more efficient and on a smaller scale over time. So there's this, dialogue and this necessary reciprocal dependence between the hardware and the software element when it comes to a computer. It's not necessarily that there's a kind of like a one-to-one directional flow between one and the other. And I think ignoring that, relationship between the hardware and the software element is also something that leads to this kind of ultra abstract idea of the mind as operating in this kind of like symbolic software space. And
Right.
yeah, neuroscientists, with regard to the brain and neuroscience, it's not clear like what is exactly is meant by neurons communicate information. Okay, so there's
Right.
a voltage, we can observe, an electrochemical impulse. There are these things, neurotransmitters, which is basically just like the release of complex biochemical compounds.
Mhm.
And we can observe those things, and we know that this is happening in the brain. But why do we then what is it that allows us to then say, okay, well, that analog voltage, that like that's happening between one neuron and another is like communicating information in the sense of a kind of analog of binary code that's containing a compressed representation of something. That's a,
Mhm.
that's a hypothesis, right? Like one thing is something we can observe, and the other part of that equation is not something that we would be capable of observing even. Um,
Right.
so
Did you hear about this study funded by Meta? I think it was done in France, where they were able to use electrical signals from patients with epilepsy. So they already had all the electrodes implanted in them that they could then also use for research purposes. And they basically are arguing in the paper that was published like last week that, oh, LLMs learn language in the same way that the human brain does. And the problem is, of course, this is funded by Meta. And so there's a clear vested interest in, you know, making sure that we are always collapsing that difference between how the brain functions as part of the whole human organism and person, equating that to the LLM. Obviously, that serves the business interests of these big AI companies because the more we can collapse that difference, the more the AI hype bubble continues to expand. Um, and so, but why is you talk about J.J. Gibson as a sort of, late 20th century um, inheritor and developer of this Bergsonian approach. And he really makes very clear, despite using information himself, that that's probably the wrong word because Shannon information is not at all the sort of semantic, meaningful information that human beings deal in. So what's what's the difference there? And can you kind of unpack how this slippage occurs where a metaphor gets mistaken for a concrete reality?
yeah, I mean, to go to pursue that latter part of the question is getting into the whole mechanism of human thought and its relationship with language and how language kind of comes to solidify thought and offer it these cadres, as Bergson would say, these boxes or these ways of thinking where we can easily kind of express something that's ultimately inexpressible. And then over time, we kind of take the cadre or the concept for the thing itself that we were originally trying to refer to. And hence why, the poet is really the best at expressing the inexpressible, because he's always going to find 100 different images to describe the same thought or feeling. So
Right.
that's a sort of epistemological, wider epistemological question. Um, with regard to the first part of the question, well, Gibson, I mean, why does he use information? I think he's clear that it's metaphorical. I mean, Gibson, I think that there's really been a resurgence and a recognition, with these embodied and activist psychologists, and recognizing that Gibson really got a lot right about perception. He really understood perception, and he
Mhm.
understood perception in that biological organismic sense, which is really something that we kind of lost sight of really ever since Aristotle in a way. In the, as when we got the severed head kind of mind-body dualism of the 17th century and started kind of locating perception as this representation happening in the theater of consciousness, we kind of forgot about the bare fact that, well, the animal perceives its environment, but not only does it perceive its environment, it acts upon its environment. And so for Gibson, when he says like perception is information pickup, what he's really trying to say is that, the animal just sees the environment and sees it as synonymous with certain actions. So like there's certain gradations of, he has so many examples, but spectral reflection, color reflection, or gradations of surface terrain, and different types of like ecological formations like openings or closings. These are things that the animal just perceives in its perceptual layout and knows as like, can walk through here, can't walk through that, the hard surface, like soft surface is, adjust movement down this slope, like, or pick up movement on this smooth slope. And these are things that are, proved also through different experimental hypothesis, experimental settings like visual cliff experiment, which Piaget did with young children. That babies wouldn't crawl over what looked like a cliff, even though it wasn't actually a cliff.
Mm.
So I think that when he talks about information pickup, I do think it's really quite an unfortunate word because it's become also associated with so many other things. But he's absolutely repudiating the idea that there's this kind of stream of information in the sense of a kind of code or bare vibrational, computational reality that is then having to be ingested by a mechanism that somehow extracts that and then jumbles it up through a series of operations and projects it back out from the mind in a certain way. And whether you think that process is happening, from things to mind first, which is like realism, or whether you think it's happening from mind to things first, which is idealism, in either
Mhm.
case, you end up having a problem, which is either the external world is like basically delusive, or it is real, but we're always going to, see it in a way that that is not really an accurate reflection of it. So I think when what Gibson does is really kind of resituates perception in the biological and ecological domain, and by that is capable of avoiding a myriad philosophical complexities and false problems.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned this idea that perception is just a kind of controlled hallucination, as Anil Zeth, a contemporary neuroscientist, would put it. But that idea goes back, to Helmholtz, as I said earlier. But there was this contemporary of Bergson's that I hadn't heard of, Hippolyte Taine. Taine, is that how you pronounce it?
And
Who used this phrase vertical hallucination. And so again, it's just like I feel like neuroscience is 150 years behind philosophy in many respects in dealing with these questions. Um, but yeah, it's so tempting with the amazing application of Claude Shannon's information theory to engineering to to have that success migrate metaphorically into our understanding of consciousness and the brain. Um, but the danger here is Whitehead called it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Um, and maybe we can talk a little bit about LLMs and these transformer models that are taking, as you put it, the results of thought, and this massive library of the entire internet being used to train these models on 1,000 times more text than your average human being could experience in multiple lifetimes. Um, it's like literally 1,000th of the amount of words for an infant, a child, to begin to learn to speak than it takes one of these LLMs to begin to string a, you know, halfway uh, meaningful sentence together. Um, but it's this old theory of associationism is being revamped and applied in the case of these LLMs. But we're missing this crucial distinction between the activity of thinking and then the products of that thinking, which is language. And there's no question that language and thinking are intimately related. But I think the temptation with these LLMs is to collapse that distinction and to imagine that somehow a symbolic um, uh, processing system that's rooted in just statistical analysis of how likely words are to occur next to each other, that is the same as our thinking activity, and that it might eventually, maybe we just have to train it on, a few more uh, internets, that it will become conscious. Um, it's like magical thinking. But yeah, can you talk about how you say Bergson distinguishes between thinking activity and then language and words as the result of that activity, and how that would disabuse us of this mistaken idea that ChatGPT is going to wake up suddenly in a few weeks?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the problem is really, the problem of thinking this way in terms of the LLMs is really kind of generated by the advent of the discipline of cognitive science and analytic philosophy in general. And analytic philosophy really takes language as the sort of the best thing we can know and analyze, and cognitive science takes language as the paradigmatic representation of thought. Thought just is linguistic. Like it's in linguistic, not even necessarily in the sense of words or grammatical, but in the sense that it is grammar-like and it's symbolic. And so, to think is to kind of have symbols and put these symbols into relationships with one another according to, predefined grammar-like rules. And this, again, is a theory that's developed in reaction to and in light of the computer. So we have this, symbiosis between these different disciplines that were happening: cognitive science, analytic philosophy, and computational technology, which really thought that it was a useful and important tool to think about thought itself as reducible or equivalent to language. I mean, you know, Bergson is able to free himself of ever falling into that kind of a trap because, first of all, he's thinking about the mind dynamically. So he's thinking about the mind as activity, or as a series of activities, as a series of directions or movements. And so thought is never something that's solid or capable of being properly solidified. And if you kind of were able to look back at that original movement of consciousness, you'll see that it's not actually linguistically expressed. It's pre-linguistic. The continuity of mind and the continuity of thought is something that comes to manifest itself as or express itself as words. And those words mark kind of the termination of the thought, and they try and they grasp, after that original movement, that original thing that they're trying to express.
Mhm.
And I think really Bergson must have been inspired by Plotinus on that front. As we know, Bergson was, the lecturer at the Collège de France in ancient history. He gave a series of formidable lectures on Plotinus and really was inspired by him. Ultimately, he says he owes a debt to three philosophers: Plotinus, Mandibirant, and a little bit to Ravesson. And Plotinus is really his spiritual and intellectual ancestor. And for Plotinus, of course, you have this kind of unexpressible, unimageable thought or noesis, which descends or processes into expression by the logos, which can be thought about both, linguistically, but also as in a agential way as well. Um,
Mhm.
but what happens of course, for Plotinus, what happens on the psychological plane of expression is the same that happens on the metaphysical, cosmological plane of creation or procession. Um, but it's really that ability for Bergson to see thought as an activity. Are we okay? Sorry, my screen just froze.
Yeah, you're back. Perception as an activity is where you got cut off.
Yeah, so I
We're
think it's
making
really
the machines very unhappy.
machines are, yeah, we've got now my camera has decided to stop working. How wonderful. Let's see. Okay.
There you are.
Yeah, it's really the ability to see mind and mental activity as movements, as directions and tendencies that allows Bergson to see language as something that emerges after the fact. Words emerge after the fact as attempts to solidify something that's originally fluid. And that's not only something that happens in the psychological sphere, but that's something that, that process of traveling from a kind of unity to a multiplicity, or from movement to its manifestation in concrete, divisible things, is something that takes place in the whole domain
Mm.
of nature in general.
Mm. Yeah, I wanna stay on this topic of the influence of Plotinus on Bergson for a second. I've actually just yesterday did a dialogue with my colleague Jack Bagby and another philosopher, Pedro Brea, and we were getting into Bergson's lectures on Plotinus. And I wonder where you feel Bergson may be um, transforming Plotinus in generative ways. I mean, Plotinus thought in terms of, even though I think he never used the term emanation, he thinks in this emanationist way, and there's a going out from the one and then a return to the one. But Bergson's an evolutionary thinker, and I think that's quite a difference from Plotinus, even though there are all of these other isomorphisms and ways that Bergson is drawing on Plotinus's theory of perception, his understanding of the logos as this mediator between um, the nous and the embodied world. But can you unpack how you understand what Bergson is doing that's sort of almost translating Plotinus maybe into an evolutionary mode of thought, if you would read it that way, or maybe you see it differently?
No, I do read it that way. I think that, gosh, I love this topic so much. I'm so glad that you brought this up.
Mm,
Um, Yeah, I do read it that way. I think it all comes back to restoring duration to
mm,
the world and to our vision of things. For Bergson, it's all about if you're seeing duration in the picture or not. Now, Plotinus for him is like, you know, is really the greatest thinker and at the same time the most frustrating thinker, because he gets there in so many ways, and then yet he's so indebted to that very Greek way of needing to negate the reality of time and subject it to the eternal, unchanging form. Um,
mhm,
and I think when he at one point he describes Plotinus as like the only real psychologist of the ancient world. And Plotinus also had this very similar way of sort of penetrating metaphysics via psychological experience, and is really like the father of that way of thinking that later Mandeville takes up and Bergson takes up. Um, and I think where it comes from is you have to restore a couple of things. You restore duration to the world, which means that the processes of the created world are real. History does unfold, and it doesn't unfold in a predetermined way. It unfolds according to, radical novelty. And the second thing is you have to restore personality to the human soul. The human person, because he or she is edified and made and expressed and co-creates herself within the fabric of duration or time unfolding cannot be reduced to an abstract soul, an idea, a kind of primordial, intelligible soup, cosmological world soul. We have to really guard the reality of the individual. And that's really also done through the memory, through a reflection on historical memory, not just, the kind of metaphysical pure memory.
Mm.
And that's where Augustine is also really interesting. And actually, it's really where the revolution of Christian thought really changes things, in general. And the third thing that you have to do, to make the Bergson to Plotinus move, is you have to restore the metaphysic of creation rather than the metaphysic of procession, which
Mm.
really comes to amount to having a kind of voluntaristic view of the origin of the cosmos. And by voluntaristic, in the sense of there's a will or an impetus behind the whole thing. And so, some interpreters of Plotinus are, really actually think he had a kind of more of a metaphysic of creation. Interestingly, like Jean Trouillard is somebody that would be more on the fringe, I guess, of Plotinian interpretation. I think with Hadot, you'd find like a little bit of a middle ground. It's not all mechanistic procession. There's something about the superabundance of the one, that Plotinus defines as generosity. He describes it as an overflowing. So overflowing implies something that happens sort of by natural necessity, but then at the same time, this generosity or overabundance or superabundance, this kind of giving forth, is something that evokes the image of love, which is really like the pinnacle or the ultimate representation of the creative elan. But I have a hunch that everything related to this question is contained in this footnote of creative evolution.
Mm.
This is like the Mitchell translation. And on this one is page 210, so chapter 3. And in this part, Bergson's describing the scattering of our attention when we're listening to someone, as the same thing as an analog of the same thing that occurs with matter, the extension of matter. So he's using this example of like, in proportion as I let myself go, let myself sort of not concentrate on what the speaker is saying, I can kind of just start to see things scattering into individual words, and then I can even find between those words these complex relations. And he's sort of using this as a way of describing how from real matter we get this kind of like extension that can dissolve or tend towards geometrical extensity,
Mm.
the tendency towards geometry. And so
Mm.
in this kind of beautiful, interesting, very interesting, and probably like little understood part of creative evolution, he's got this footnote, which is, our comparison does no more than develop the content of the term logos as Plotinus understands it. For while the logos of this philosopher is a generating and informing power, an aspect or a fragment of the psyche, on the other hand, Plotinus sometimes speaks of it as a discourse. More generally, the relation that we establish in the present chapter between extension and detension resembles in some aspects that which Plotinus supposes, some developments of which must have inspired Monsieur Ravesson, when he makes extension not indeed an inversion of original being, but an enfeeblement of its essence, one of the last stages of the procession. Yet ancient philosophy did not see what consequences this would result for mathematics. For Plotinus, like Plato, erected mathematical essences into absolute realities. Above all, it suffered itself to be deceived by the purely superficial analogy of duration with extension. It
Mm.
treated the one as it treated the other, regarding change as the degradation of immutability, the sensible as a fall from the intelligible, whence, as we shall show in the next chapter, a philosophy which fails to recognize the real function and scope of the intellect.
Mm.
Saying there,
Mm.
this is all like, this is just a development of Plotinus's idea of the logos. We're just showing how, in reality, extension emerges at the last stage of procession, and therefore mathematics, as
Mm.
far as we see mathematics in that truly Greek ancient sense, as Euclidean space and geometry, which is really the perfect mathematics. Extensions emerges at the last or one of the last stages of procession. It can't be that it's contained in the one, or that it's contained in the interpenetration of the intelligible realm. And so that's really where Plotinus gets the role of mathematics wrong. Mathematics can't be an assent or a propedeutic. It can't be a propedeutic to an assent to the absolute in the way that it is in Plato's Meno, if we're going to really look at perception honestly as this tendency towards non-being, and the closest thing towards non-being being pure geometrical extensity. But of
Mm,
course, Plotinus makes that mistake because he's refused to, he sees duration on the model of space.
right. Wow. Yeah. Thanks for pointing out that footnote. Really helpful. So,
Sorry, that was kind of a big
no,
tangent.
I'm glad you got excited about that that connection. Um, so duration. To go back to the brain and this idea that perception is some kind of a information encoding in the brain. Um, why is it that what is the relevance of Bergson's understanding of duration and the continuity of the flow of becoming that makes it impossible to reduce perception or memory to a series of states in the brain that might be informationally encoded?
It's everything, everything about his theory of duration prevents us from breaking down any transformational reality, whether that's the transformational reality of consciousness or the transformational reality of the external world and external transformations, into a series of static snapshots that are adduced and added together and juxtaposed together to give us continuity. Because you will always need the continuity as the thing that brings you from state one to state two. And this is really where his idea of the two kinds of multiplicity, going back to time and free will, is just such a revolutionary idea. Because, and one really, again, that harkens back to later Roman philosophy. This idea that there are intensive or internal parts, and there are extensive or external parts, juxtaposed parts. Now, intensive parts, like something like states of consciousness, are present us with a reality that is not a pure unity insofar as there are distinguishable features and distinguishable elements. And I right now I can look at talking to you and I can think of what I was doing earlier, and I have the words that I'm speaking and the thoughts that I'm imagining, and there's a multiplicity, there's a plurality going on, and I can look back upon my day and see it as this plurality of events, however I wish to choose to divide it.
Mm,
Um, but the flow between them is this mutual adherence, such that, no one of those events really begins and ends. No one of those states really starts and stops. They're just giving and flowing and tumbling into each other. And they're mutually, interlocked and interpenetrating, bleeding. Everything's bleeding into each other in this flow. And that's really characteristic of change in general. And change is characteristic of life, thought, perception, memory, any mental activity, but also the development of reality itself, matter itself, even inorganic matter. Change is fundamental to things.
mm,
And so the problem is, once you break down the change intellectually, you will never be able to reconstitute the original change. And so you have a couple of problems with regard to neuroscience, which is that you have the brain activity itself being broken down into different brain states, as it's called, which is like, again, the brain activity doesn't really stop between one state and the next. The brain activity is ongoing. But then you have to map those brain states, hypothesized brain states, onto hypothesized states taking place out there in the world. So, if the brain is encoding information into neural code and then translating or processing that information and then spitting it back out again as a neural representation, well, it needs something static to encode. It needs a picture to scramble up and then repeat in a new form. And the problem is that, whatever mechanism you choose for how that's achieved is going to be a purely arbitrary or conceptual mechanism, because in reality, perception itself, an ongoing array, is not capable of being broken down into individual perceptions, and those individual perceptions aren't capable of them being mapped onto individual brain states, because both the perceiving and the brain processing they're both constantly ongoing. So it's really an intellectual tool that we use to describe perception, and it's helpful insofar as, you know, it helps us to think about what would be required to perceive a scene. But the problem is we don't perceive scenes. We don't perceive, you know, stills in an animation. We perceive an ever blooming, ever growing, ever generating, qualitative, dynamic, transformational external world with a body that's constantly qualitatively transforming and is not just reducible to the head and is also interacting with that world. And so where you're going to put the barriers between something like perception one and perception two, action one, action two, encoding one and encoding two, is just going to become more and more arbitrary the more that one takes that metaphorical description literally.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, these two types of multiplicities, I mean, I'm tempted to go back to Plotinus's understanding of the logos as yes, this generative process that creates on the model of embryogenesis. So there's in that model, you begin from the whole, and the parts are differentiation of the whole, whereas the more mechanistic approach, to understanding change, for example, rather than change being a process of growth, change is understood as a rearrangement of already existing bodies, right, in an already existing container space or something. And so this understanding of change as creative advance is more on an organic. You have to root it in an organic metaphor of differentiation from a whole, right? And so that I think applies across the board, even in our understanding of the relationship of thinking and language. Um, Before I utter a sentence, it is this sort of vague unity of an idea that then I begin to articulate, and it, has these is the subject, the predicate, and each of the words. But that organic way of thinking is, uh, I guess, not as easy to or not possible to to translate into some kind of an engineering approach where one uh, would be able to gain control over a world that's imagined to be uh, an aggregate of already existing bodies that can be manipulated. And so, what gets lost in this loss of the organic metaphor and the shift to the mechanistic metaphor is the sense of time as duration, the sense of creative process, and the sense of um, wholeness as sort of um, the base, uh, the origin of all of our thinking. Um, and instead, we think we have to, if wholeness exists at all in nature, it's something that needs to be built up out of parts.
Mhm.
Right? You froze on my end. Are you still there?
You mean?
Yeah, I can hear you. Okay, good. Um,
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and so these background metaphors that are informing all of our scientific research uh, are so important because, as you point out at one point, when we forget the metaphors we're working within, it's very easy to mistake evidence and analogy or to conflate evidence and analogy. So the whole computational understanding of the mind is um, rooted in this analogy. Mind, the mind is some kind of software running on the hardware of the brain, but it's construed as though that's the discovery of the research program, right? Rather than the presupposition, right, that the research is even that's inaugurating that research program, right? So it's not a discovery, it's a metaphysical assumption,
Yes,
right?
yeah. It's the
Uh,
domain of, I mean, analogy is the domain of philosophy. I mean, Bergson does think that, you know, philosophers should use analogy, but analogy doesn't have a place in that sense, doesn't have a place in scientific formulations, except for when we're trying to interpret the scientific data. Now, there's an argument to be made that, well, scientists are also great philosophers. And at one point in time, they really were, in the sense that, there's this sort of paradigm of the Renaissance man who could do it all, who could do the philosophizing and the experimentation. But when it's disguised as experimentation rather than theorizing, I think it's not even that it's disguised. It's not like it's some conspiracy. It's just, there's just not an awareness of the degree to which a discipline like neuroscience has become, philosophical. And considering physics, I mean, theoretical physics is like entire, is like a lot of it's made up, like made up in behind a desk, the way I, make things up in here. So, but
Mhm.
because the role of the philosopher is really what's being undermined. But
Right.
what you said, I mean, I just have to say, what you said about the organic analogy, and the importance of that organic recognition in Plotinus. I mean, of course, for Plotinus, the image to represent life is
Mm.
the seed that is a single, unified, a union of intensive, dynamic relations and elements that by virtue of its dynamical potential relations to the soil and the sun and the earth and water and rain is capable of flourishing into extending into this multiplicity, which is the plant. And
Mm.
this is why Bergson writes creative evolution. And he comes to realize that the whole problem of causality and the whole raison d'être behind the mechanistic worldview that had taken hold of man's thought since the Renaissance is owing to this neglect of the biological as really the most important domain of or not the most important, but at least, a very important aspect of philosophical research in general, and the biological as really where we're going to see and be able to express um, some of the most complex philosophical ideas on the origin and nature of the cosmos and the origin and nature of mind are going to have to be seen through that domain of biological, evolutionary, creative causality, which is the antithesis of the mechanistic. And now it's interesting because he doesn't say that the mechanistic view is entirely wrong. And you also pointed this out when you mentioned, engineering, and we have to look at things in this way, in this mechanistic way, in order to make progress, really, in order to have technological progress. I mean, so Bergson will say that not only is this something that's just belongs to the man in the ivory tower with his highfalutin mathematics, but it also belongs to the average person. In order to act upon the external world, we have to break things down into their elements. It's basic deduction and logical reasoning and grammar and, breaking down a perceptual scene, planning out the future in terms of distinct elements that we can relate to each other, doing something like Peircean abduction and looking and developing a hypothesis. I mean, these are things that all depend upon this capacity of abstraction. But he also says in creative evolution, importantly, that this isn't just something the mind does. It's also matter does lend itself to this treatment. Like there is something about matter that can be, especially, inorganic, brute corporeality that does lend itself to the mathematical mechanistic treatment because matter is defined as the tendency towards exteriority and the tendency towards extension. The tendency towards extension, instantaneity, and dispersion, and pure multiplicity, geometrical multiplicity. Matter isn't quite identifiable with that, which is why he refuses to go as far as Descartes' res extensa or as Plotinus's non-being.
Right.
Because we know that matter is actually qualitative, extended, transformational, but it does go down that road. It leads down the road to geometry. And so for that reason, our calculations are successful because there's something about matter that
Mm.
does conform to that mathematical treatment. Now, the problem is when we take that mathematical treatment and that mechanistic view of things and we begin to apply it up the scale of being, first from, the brute inorganic world, then to dynamical systems and matter, and then beyond that we start with the organisms and beyond the organisms and the relationships between species. And, we then apply it to the mind, which is the organism, the mathematical method is already failing. All the current biologists tell us that. All the contemporary biologists are moving away from this kind of statistical algorithmic view of evolution and are really, doing more kind of qualitative, holistic, integral accounts of organismal agency and top-down kind of accounts of how biological formation in a
Hmm.
Whiteheadian sense almost, and process biology, I guess.
Mm.
That's really become en vogue in biology lately. But so it strains, the mathematical mechanistic model is straining to be applied to the organism, but where it's absolutely just completely false is when it's applied to mind. Then it's just actually not only then it's actually no longer useful. Um,
Mm.
it really becomes documenting the life of mind with that mechanistic worldview leads us to the Hippolyte Taines and the Humes of the world who just have a really impoverished, almost embarrassing account of something like how thought occurs. That doesn't even come close to, a
Yeah.
5-year-old's holding a leaf in the palm of her hand, or a poet, describing a simple feeling, um,
Mm.
in terms of grasping the complexity and the beauty of mind.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of one of my favorite lines from Whitehead. I think it's in Science in the Modern World, where he says, some people express themselves as though brains, sense organs, and nerves are the only real things in an entirely imaginary world. Um, Again, like criticizing these predictive processing, free energy principle sorts of understandings of consciousness as controlled hallucination, and forgetting that the brain itself is an image in this field of images. Couldn't be the producer of images. It's such a violent abstraction to rip ourselves from our actual embodied experience of the world and imagine we might be able to explain all of that via something like information processing when, um, in these information ontologies and this temptation to understand the physical world itself as somehow made of information, it's like forgetting that information in Shannon's sense is like it's a way of measuring something. It's a tool for measuring something. And so to say the physical world is made of information, it's like saying the physical world is made of meters or
Yeah.
inches or something. And when you make that translation, it makes it obvious how absurd uh, that claim is.
Well, then it's also equally absurd because these people are so-called materialists, but then they're speaking like idealists at that point.
Yeah,
So they're speaking like they've got a stoic materialism, which isn't really materialism in
right.
a modern sense, because stoic matter is like spiritual, basically.
Mm,
Um, yeah.
right. Um, Back to Plotinus for a second. Um, when Bergson is lecturing on Plotinus, he talks about uh, how we exist sort of in suspended between these two infinities, the infinity of the one and the infinity of matter, or both are unlimited in a sense and can't be thought. Um, for Plotinus, that difference is all important, and the fact that they're both the one and matter are in a sense unlimited, unthinkable, doesn't mean that they're equivalent. But I often, in my resistance to that kind of hierarchical emanationist metaphysics, which, otherwise I love Plotinus, but I have this more evolutionary view, and I don't want um, physicality and embodiment to simply be a fall, and something that needs to be escaped in order to assent to a truth that would lack um, materiality. And so, how do you relate to, all of these movements in like the 4EA approach to cognitive science, the importance of embodiment? Um, do you feel that there's a tension there with this Platonian understanding of assent and matter as mere privation? Do you want, do you feel like Bergson helps us um, shift to not just seeing matter as a kind of nothing, but as an important source of resistance for this elan to take shape and proliferate. Yeah, where do you stand on the nature of materiality and embodiment, and maybe in contrast to Plotinus?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely, I definitely adopt the Bergsonian vision of, of a creative metaphysic, and that metaphysics of creation as opposed to procession, which implies that, the products of creation, the world itself, are not just a fall or a diminution or enfeeblement of the essence of the one, but that there's this, intentional organization behind it such that it matters. And also that the individual human person within that whole matters and his actions matter and they ripple throughout the world and they survive with him beyond death. And again, Bergson's project to define the soul in terms of memory is a restoration of personality at the core of the human person. And Plotinus, recognizes memory as immaterial. But of course, he's going to recognize something more like pure memory, non-personal memory, as
Mhm.
as purely immaterial. And he's going to say that, once we're reunited with the essence of the one, who cares if they remember their spouse or their children? And obviously there's something to that in the sense of, we're not going to be able to apply our vision in the afterlife to the way that we envision things down here. But at the same time, you kind of think like, that doesn't
Yeah.
sound right. That doesn't sound, that doesn't sound right. There's something about the flight to the supermundane in Plotinus and that mystical flight, which of course negates the concrete reality of the world. And I think that there's absolutely a place to be reached with Bergson and with someone like Augustine, who is very much, adopting the Plotinian philosophy and reinvesting it with this, re-injecting it with this sense of personalism that
Yeah.
frankly wasn't really possible in the ancient world before the revolution of Christian anthropology.
Right.
This idea that the individual human person is really like, really matters, like their life story, their actions really, really do matter. Doesn't really emerge in the Western consciousness so much at all
So
until.
you would agree Plotinus needs incarnation to bring some
Yeah,
balance to this.
Plotinus definitely needs incarnation, and also the methodology of Plotinus also needs the integration of scientific data, the integration of data from biology, the integration of facts and of observations in the external world. And that's where I think a Bergsonian innovation in philosophy is also really important because we're not just operating in the paradigm of logic, or we can let the analytic philosophers do that. They do a great job of it, but there's something about that deducing from the a priori that in light of the way our technology and our science has developed, doesn't make sense anymore. Like we actually have to take into account this data, and the philosopher's role ought to be to interpret that data in an intelligible way and bring it to union with intelligible, deductive kinds of reasoning and synthetic models. But where I think Plotinus is really important today, still, despite those kind of important criticisms, is in his ability to clearly see dynamic, intensive, invisible realities.
Hmm.
In the fact that these dynamic, intensive, invisible realities are not are they're so empirically obvious. They're discoverable by a priori reasoning, but they're discoverable also by a posteriori reasoning, and they're discoverable in the psychological plane and the cosmological, natural plane, biological plane. That they are capable, their actual mechanism, or in the sense of their inner workings are actually capable of being expressed in ways that are clear. They will, those expressions will have to rely, of course, on analogy and on some degree of kind of poetic theorizing. But you're capable of discerning them. Like you are capable of discerning something like, the dynamic spiritual nature of your own mind and consciousness. And
Mm,
for Plotinus and for later Roman philosophers in general, that's just like, that's obvious. Like
mm,
it would be so silly to be, to say like there's no invisible realities and everything is just visible, ergo physical. And
yeah,
I mean, first of all, their understanding of the physical was a lot more kind of spiritualized in general, but that's really, I think, where that kind of introspective certainty,
right,
penetration of the psychological as the way of accessing and describing those invisible transformational realities is something that the Platinian methodology and the Platinian model uh, could really be mined for and used for today.
right. Yeah, no, I love that. It seems like in the 20th century with the rise of cognitive science, I guess, especially, I mean, behaviorism before that, and computational cognitive science to me feels like just still behaviorism. It's just now we're treating the neurons as the black box instead of the whole organism. But it's introspection got um, dismissed as a source of vertical knowledge of anything, whether the soul or the world. Um, we have phenomenology, but not that computationalists ever took phenomenology that seriously, but phenomenology coming out of Husserl seems more focused on these generic structures of experience rather than on the personal dimension, which you've been emphasizing is so important here. And so, yeah,
Phenomenology it studies the phenomena qua phenomena, right? Like, and I think, but that's why Bergson is so not a phenomenon, like because he's studying, something like matter and memory, where he's getting us to that brute reality of just perceiving the images, seeing the external world as these images. It seems phenomenological, but of course he's not studying them as qua phenomena. He's studying them qua reality. This is a direct access upon reality. This is not just our phenomenal representation that really like still we're not really sure if it really corresponds to the things in themselves kind of thing, but that's just a side note, sorry.
Yeah, and just the way that, phenomenologists tend to write, and maybe Merleau-Ponty's different because he's influenced by Bergson, but this way in which the who's being addressed by a Husserl is sort of this like subject in general. Whereas I feel when I'm reading Bergson, he's talking to me. He's trying to direct me to my own attention, right?
Yeah.
And there's this just personal connection I feel to him. And that's why so many people love reading him. That's why he won a Nobel Prize in Literature. It's like he's really making these arguments in a way that's directed to our personal existence and our stake in existence as persons, which, yeah, is different, very different from the usual phenomenological methodology.
Yeah,
Um,
and he's giving us the tools. As you say, he's sort of like guiding you through this hinterland of your inner experience, which is again something that I think Augustine, really picks up in the Confessions or even in De Trinitate. Like he's guiding you through this. It really he's guiding himself, but he's also guiding you through this kind of this domain that is your pure kind of unadulterated mind, and you're retrieving yourself in your inner dynamism. But in Bergson's case, I mean, he's really giving you a tool, a methodology for doing that, which is this methodology of perceiving everything sub specie durationis. And,
mm,
it's duration as a tool, as the tool for introspection. Getting back to the original impulsive movement of thought and seeing it as duration, as this pure, uninterrupted continuity, that symphonic inherence that will always be able to be retrieved as a starting point in the introspective journey, which I think is really such an innovation. And I think that kind of duration as methodology is not talked about so much in Bergson, but it is the method. It's synonymous with introspection for him.
mm. Yeah, it's so empowering to be told by a philosopher to trust your experience because so much of science, neuroscience, cognitive science says, no, you shouldn't really trust your experience. It's constitutively hallucinatory and misleads you, and we need these objectifying, uh, um, you know, um, understandings of the brain as an information processor to get below the deceptive nature of experience to see what's really going on. And I feel like not only does that rob personhood of its ontological and spiritual significance. But it misleads us scientifically as well, into a yeah, blind alley, like I said earlier.
Yeah, I think Bergson has a funny line where he's like, whoever has not taken a philosophy class would not doubt that like the table before them is really just is there and that their perception of it is like the same thing as the table.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's really true. I mean, there's kind of initial like, whoa, yeah, maybe everything isn't really what it seems. And like that's a really important step, I think, in anyone's like critical thinking capacity and like that sort of Cartesian doubt with a purpose and with the purpose of kind of like getting your mind to triumph over the way things are and the way it usually perceives things. I think
Mhm.
it's a great philosophical tool, obviously, and especially like when I don't know, when I'm like teaching young students in philosophy, it's always a great place to start.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's to stop there would seem to really it would be seem to be a real loss for philosophy. 'Cause
Yeah.
like at that point, it sounds like philosophy just, as Pascal would say, isn't even worth an hour's trouble.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and it's not that experience or perception isn't sometimes misleading. Of course it is. We misperceive all the time, but the point is you dig deeper and you discover a broader or a richer perception that replaces the prior delusive perception, but you never get beyond experience. There's nothing on the other side of it. You're always going to be in experience. And so,
I know. And it's even the physicists. I mean, I mean, you're calculating like, the rate at which the black hole is super collapsing in like the ninth dimension of whatever. And it's like, but you're the one doing that. Like
right.
that's you. Like you're the one beautifully. I'm sure it's very beautiful, but you're the one who's working and wrestling with those equations and you're not leaving your mind and accessing what's going on in the Netherlands of space time. Like you as a person, your calculations wouldn't exist and would mean nothing if you weren't there to kind of dynamically wrestle with them. And yeah, the experience really is all we have, and the experience is capable of being deepened. It's capable of being understood. It's capable of being understood personally and synthetically, systematically. What it's not capable of being is being measured. It's not capable of being systematized in any kind of quantitative metrical system or even like a law-like metrical system. But it's there, and it's definitely the starting point, and there are layers to it. There are deep layers to it that can be traveled rigorously with an attentive mind. I don't mean in this kind of like, taking ayahuasca and going to the inner Jungian regions of the archetypes. I mean in a thoughtful capacity. There's layers to the self that are capable of being discovered. And, like something like the relationship between thought, memory, understanding, and will, and these dynamical activities of the mind can be articulated, can be expressed. And as we sort of delve into that, we'll understand more of what mind is and what the person is and what the self is. And restoring selfhood, I think, is really like the main, the project.
Mm, yeah.
Project.
So I only have a few minutes left here. I wonder if I could ask a more personal question about your own sort of religious and spiritual orientation and like how these ideas cash out for you, and not as an academic, but just as, a woman trying to understand her own existence. Like, where do you find a sense of home and orientation in spiritual matters?
Yeah, I mean it's a long question. But it would require a long response. But I when I was first starting to study philosophy as an undergraduate, I actually became very terribly ill.
Mm, mm.
I was
Analytic philosophy was what you said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Analytic philosophy was the source of my illness. But no, I had a serious disease,
Mm,
unfortunately, and I was 18 at the time, and I spent a year in the hospital. basically, in and out of the hospital, like on death's door several times. I had 3 or 4 major surgeries,
Mm.
and just like went went through it. Went to death and back several times. And I was already studying philosophy before that, but I had no idea what I was doing or who I was until I went through that insane, immense amount of suffering. And in that time, I felt transfigured and spiritualized as a human being. In the times that I was the most sick, I felt like I was the most spiritual. I felt I was going somewhere, and that place was not physical. And I felt the presence of love and the presence of a person who was there, and that everything was beautiful and okay. And I since, thank God, recovered from that illness. I'm still like I still am such a sickly philosopher. I'm living out. We're keeping the sickly philosopher archetype alive, single-handedly over here, but much better. And obviously, back in the world of like time and matter and action, like man of action, let's go. Roboticism, automatism, but that will never, be gone from my worldview. And I've become since very passionate about restoring a kind of Christian personalist philosophy, but one that's really like, I don't know, designed to kind of rescue people from the hinterlands of spiritualism and bring them to recognizing, like, rather than the universe, like a personal creator. I think the personal creator is very important. And also going from a kind of cosmological, non-existent soul to a personal soul.
Mm.
And for me, I think those are, an individual that survives, not reincarnation, not losing yourself in the cosmological soup of the one. A person, you are a person who's loved and created with a specific purpose.
Mm.
And so for my spiritual vision, I think that that's kind of where I am. And in terms of like what's injected into my philosophy, those are like the personal motives that get me to where I end up, whatever rivulet I end up traveling down in my
Mm.
philosophical research. But if I can kind of help to edify or express a view of reality that's not atheism, but not, a kind of blind, or dare I say, not really blind, but a kind of,
Vague spirituality.
big spiritualism. Yeah, that's not rooted in personhood fundamentally. Then that's my goal, I guess, and that's what informs my worldview. But beyond that, it's I don't do much otherwise.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that. Last question, I guess, is whether you feel like you're noticing this um, shift occur where young people are actually returning to, I mean, Christianity in particular. I think it's happening in the UK too. I'm definitely noticing it here in the US, and not just young people. I mean, there are all sorts of atheists, public intellectuals who had been defending atheism, converting to Christianity all of a sudden. And I think some of that seems like culturally motivated rather than say religiously or having an actual connection to Christ or something. But nonetheless, there does seem to be, as you were saying earlier when we first started talking, like atheism's old hat now and not cool anymore. And so so you're noticing that as well.
Oh yeah, I think it's definitely not cool. Everybody that I know that is, young basically is like, into some kind of, the universe or some kind of spirituality, and everybody that I meet that's like over 30, 33, 35 is like still an atheist. But yeah, I mean, I really actually, I don't like so much like cultural political aspects of this movement. And I think, for me personally, like I'm not a political philosopher, I'm not a cultural, like I really try to stay away from that, very much like Bergson. Or maybe the last book when I'm like 65 will be something like the two
Yeah.
morality and religion.
That's
Um,
smart. It gets nasty when you dig into that stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's also just like for me, in light of this story I just told you, for me, it's really about that. It's really about like restoring an individual sense of purpose and an individual and relate, in relationship to the other as well. But culture, politics, what's cool, what's edgy, what's different, like that's meaningless really when it comes to like what's the metaphysical truth and what gets you out of bed in the morning and what does it feel like to see the sun on the river and what does it feel like to give your child a hug and all of those beautiful, irreducible, complex aspects of life. There has to be a metaphysics today that accommodates for that and articulates that. And I think that it is an impoverishment to be, to reduce, the beauty of that metaphysical truth to like the latest cultural fashion or political kind of form of resistance. And so
Right.
I really personally try to distance myself from that association.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, um, so much more to talk about. I can't wait to finish your thesis, which again, I've only read chapter two, which is brilliant. I'm going to a conference this weekend that's going to be full of AI accelerationists, and so I'm well equipped now to introduce some new arguments. So thank you for that. But yeah, we should do this again,
It will
and
be published soon.
will be your dissertation will be
Yeah,
published.
I hope it'll be
Book.
published by the maybe like January.
Okay,
At this
awesome.
rate, but I'm yeah, I'm really grateful that you said that, and I'm looking forward to you reading the rest of it as well. And I've been working now on some more kind of the will. Now that I did memory, I'm bored of memory, and I'm interested in the will, and dynamic metaphysics of the creative will, and especially as it relates to human creativity and in light of the AI cognition, intelligence discussions, like is
Yeah,
does intelligence really exist without the will? No, it doesn't. And,
right.
what is that? What is that will? Well, again, surprise, surprise, dynamic spiritual activity.
Hmm.
The will is again another thing in philosophy of mind that's like, what does that even mean? Who talks about the will these days,
Right.
It's not beliefs, perceptions, desires, or judgments. But there is intentionality, which is a really interesting kind of new thing, and that's recognizing attention, intention, and
Mhm.
that's related to the will. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to publishing more, hopefully. The notoriously slow start of an academic career.
Well, glad to hear you moving forward. Glad to hear the dissertation will be published. I'm certainly already sharing it with a lot of people. So thank you, Victoria. This was so much fun, and let's do it again sometime.
Definitely. Thanks so much, Matt.
Uh,
Okay.
Take,
Bye.
take care. Have a good night.
You too. Cheers.